And welcome once again to Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr, joined as always by Juan Zarate, our national security analyst. Juan, good to see you back.
Bob, great to see you.
In the time you've been gone, this Syria crisis seems to have just gotten broader and more confusing. The president first drew a red line, threatened action, and now, as we know, it's before the Congress. This is a bit of a mess.
Well, it's a mess. It's a mess on the ground, obviously, with the bloodiness of the Civil War. It's now a mess in terms of the politics and the credibility of the U.S. And what you have really is, I think, the president reacting to the lack of multilateral support for what would have been a punitive strike given the use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime, or at least believed so by the U.S., and a lack of popular support in the U.S., looking at the poll numbers, hearing from members of Congress. And so the president, having set a red line that he probably didn't imagine Assad would cross, Assad has now crossed it multiple times and done so viciously. The president then has to act, but the problem he saw was he would have to act largely alone. And for a president and an administration that came in talking about being more multilateral, relying more on diplomacy, and certainly not appearing to be as unilateralist as the prior Bush administration, that was a very uncomfortable position for him to be in. Remember, this is the Nobel Peace Prize winner who would, in essence, be acting unilaterally to use force against another regime.
We don't yet know what Congress is going to do. Public opinion is wildly and widely against the idea of military strikes. But the president's put his marker down, and he continues with the rhetoric that a price needs to be extracted from Assad. If Congress does not give him support, what does he have to do?
Well, he's got a huge calculation to make at that point, Bob, because he has said, and I think has created a safe harbor for himself to say, I have the authority as commander-in-chief to make this call. I do not necessarily need congressional authorization to do this, but I want it. He hasn't wanted to repeat that too often because then it undercuts the very debate happening on Capitol Hill and the value that the members have in terms of their vote. But he will have a calculation. He has put American credibility on the line in terms of reacting to a chemical attack. He has said it's essential, not just for the U.S., but for the international community. And so if he doesn't have support from Congress, he's going to have a calculation to make. And I don't know what he decides, because this is a president that has staked his reputation and the administration's reputation on acting out of principle, on the norms of international law, and with congressional support. If he doesn't have congressional support, doesn't have a UN mandate, doesn't have NATO with him, doesn't even have the British along with him, and acts perhaps with the French alongside, that looks awful unilateral and runs counter to the notion of the tides of war receding in the Middle East.
But if the United States does nothing after drawing the red line, after repeatedly saying this can't stand, what is the message to the rest of the world? What is the message to North Korea and Iran and others?
I think it's devastating to the United States, its credibility. It's devastating for precisely the reason you mentioned. Keep in mind, Bob, power is not just the ability to wield military power. It's the perception of exerting your will on others without having to use force. And to the extent that people think that our words don't matter, that we're not willing to actually take hard steps when it matters, like this, then it really does send a message around the world that America is a toothless tiger, and there really is no other actor in the international community that constrains or can enforce international norms without American leadership. Like it or not, I'm an American too. I don't like the fact that we're always having to be in the lead, but the reality is we're the ones who have to lead on hard decisions, and if we're not there, the international community is not going to act. And when the president talks about the international community, it's a bit of a chimera. The international community is us. It's us leading. And if we're not leading, not taking the hard steps, these things don't happen. And the North Koreans are watching, the Iranians, and others, including our allies who rely on our power and protection, are watching. And without that, and with a signal that we aren't credible, that's a hugely damaging moment, and in some ways becomes a self-fulfilling manifestation of the prophecy of the decline of American power.
And as we wrap this up, one of the problems here is it's not clear to a lot of people, including me, what's the mission? Is it to degrade the chemical weapon stockpiles, deter further use? Is it to weaken Assad? Has that been clear, and how important is it that the mission is clear?
Yeah, it's always essential that a military mission be clear. And in particular, post-Iraq, a sense that we have clarity as to what happens after the initial strike, after the shock and awe, what happens after the fact. And so the fact that the administration has vacillated and had previously not really had a serious strategy. We've talked about it here on Flashpoints. Not had a serious strategy, not talked about it publicly, and then in some ways vacillated over the last week or so over what the strategy is, has charged the debate on Capitol Hill and created confusion. Because in some ways, this is just meant to be limited, punitive, a deterrent to future use of chemical weapons. But in some ways, you've got to degrade the capability, if that's to make any sense. And there are some, like Senator McCain, saying, look, that's not enough. You actually have to shift the battlefield here, because if Assad still has the ability to go after the rebels, to do these kinds of atrocities, you're really not having the effect you want. And at the end of the day, he's going to be able to use chemical weapons, biological weapons, Scud missiles, whatever he likes against his own citizens. So the fact that our mission isn't clear, the strategy hasn't been set, has added confusion and has muddled the debate in Capitol Hill and adds another variable to the vote.
Very fluid situation, one we'll be watching. We have to leave it right there for the moment. We'll be back with others.
Thank you, Bob.
Juan, thanks again, and thanks to you for watching Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr. We'll see you next time.